Can you really sell your soul? The Truth Across Religion, History, and Psychology by David Russo. Across history, people have feared the same unsettling idea that something essential within them can be traded away without ever signing a contract or meeting a devil. From ancient myths to modern careers, from religious warnings to psychological breakdowns, the notion of selling your soul keeps reappearing whenever desire collides with consequence. It is not just a story about supernatural bargains, it is a question about identity itself, and whether a person can slowly drift so far from their values that they no longer recognize who they are. Chapter 1. Where the idea of the soul comes from. The concept of the soul is one of the oldest intellectual and spiritual ideas in human history. Long before written philosophy, early humans tried to explain the difference between a living body and a dead one. Breath, warmth, and consciousness seemed to vanish at death, suggesting that something invisible had left. This invisible something became what many cultures would later call the soul. In ancient civilizations, the soul was not always a single, unified idea. In ancient Egypt, it was divided into multiple parts, each responsible for different aspects of existence after death. In early Greek thought, philosophers debated whether the soul was material, divine, or purely rational. These early frameworks show that the soul was never just a religious concept. It was also an early attempt at psychology. As religions developed, the soul became increasingly moralized. It was no longer just what animates life, but what defines goodness, judgment, and destiny. The soul became something that could be purified or tainted depending on one's actions. This shifted the idea from a neutral life force to a deeply ethical core of identity. Over time, the soul became closely tied to the idea of the self. To lose the soul began to mean losing direction, meaning, or humanity itself. This transformation is crucial because it lays the foundation for later ideas that the soul is not only real, but also vulnerable, valuable, and somehow exchangeable. Chapter 2. The Devil's Bargain in Folklore. Stories of bargains with dark forces appear across cultures, but they take a particularly recognizable form in European folklore. These tales often involve a human in desperate circumstances encountering a supernatural figure who offers immediate relief in exchange for something eternal. The terms of the deal are rarely complicated. The cost is always the soul. The most famous version of this narrative is the Faust legend, where a scholar trades his soul for limitless knowledge and worldly pleasure. The story has been retold in countless forms because it captures a universal tension between ambition and consequence. It suggests that there is always a hidden price behind unchecked desire. However, similar patterns appear outside European traditions as well. Many cultures contain cautionary tales about spirits, tricksters, or deities who grant wishes with devastating consequences. These stories often function less as literal warnings and more as moral frameworks that explore the limits of human desire. What connects all these narratives is not belief in actual soul transactions, but fear of imbalance. They suggest that when a person tries to exceed natural limits, whether in power, knowledge, or pleasure, something essential may be lost in the process. The soul becomes a symbol of what is sacrificed when desire overrides restraint. Chapter 3. Religion and the idea of spiritual loss. In most religious traditions, the soul is not something that can be exchanged or owned by another being. Instead, it is something that can be nurtured, damaged, or obscured through human action. The focus is not on transaction, but on alignment with moral or divine order. Different religions describe this process in different ways. Some emphasize separation from a divine source as the primary form of spiritual harm. Others focus on karma, sin, or imbalance as forces that shape the condition of the soul over time. Despite these differences, the underlying idea remains consistent. The soul reflects the quality of one's life. Within this framework, selling your soul is not a literal act, but a metaphor for moral deviation. It describes a life path where short-term desires override long-term values. The danger is not that the soul is taken away, but that it becomes disconnected from what gives it meaning. This distinction is important because it reframes the entire question. Religion often does not support the idea of ownership over the soul by external forces. Instead, it presents the soul as something continuously shaped by choice, responsibility, and awareness. Chapter 4, the psychological interpretation. From a psychological perspective, the soul is often replaced with concepts like identity, self-awareness, or emotional integration. Rather than being a metaphysical object, it becomes a way of describing the coherence of the self. In this sense, losing the soul can be understood as losing psychological unity. People sometimes experience states where they feel detached from themselves or their actions. This can happen under stress, trauma, or prolonged conflict between values and behavior. In these moments, individuals may feel as if they are observing their lives rather than living them fully. Selling your soul, in this interpretation, becomes a metaphor for a compromise. It might describe situations where someone repeatedly chooses external rewards, status, money, approval, at the expense of internal values. Over time, this can create a sense of fragmentation between who a person is and what they do. Psychology does not require a literal soul to explain these experiences. Instead, it focuses on the human need for coherence. When the coherence breaks down, people often reach for symbolic language to describe what they feel as having been lost. Chapter 5, Fame, Power, and the Modern Soul Trade. In modern culture, the idea of selling your soul is often linked to fame and success. Public figures are frequently accused of selling out when they appear to prioritize profit or popularity over authenticity. This modern version of the concept reflects the same ancient anxiety in a new environment. Unlike traditional folklore, there is rarely a single defining moment of exchange. Instead, the process is gradual and cumulative. Small compromises, repeated decisions, and shifting priorities slowly reshape identity over time without any obvious turning point. This gradual transformation can create a psychological tension. On the outside, a person may appear successful, admired, or powerful. Internally, however, they may feel disconnected from the motivations that once drove them. Success becomes separated from meaning. In this sense, the modern soul trade is not supernatural but systematic. It reflects the pressures of environments where visibility, performance, and productivity are rewarded, sometimes at the expense of personal authenticity. Chapter 6, The Soul as Symbol. One of the most useful ways to understand the idea of selling the soul is to treat the soul as symbolic language. Rather than referring to a literal object, it represents the deepest sense of identity, values, and inner coherence. Symbols allow humans to compress complex emotional experiences into understandable forms. The soul becomes a way of describing what cannot easily be measured: purpose, integrity, or a sense of being aligned with oneself. When people say someone has lost their soul, they are usually responding to observable changes. These might include emotional detachment, moral compromise, or a shift in personality. The language is metaphorical, but it points to real psychological and social phenomena. The persistence of this symbol suggests that it fulfills a communicative need. It gives people a way to express the feeling that something essential has changed in a person's character, even if no physical or measurable object has been lost. Chapter 7. Can anything be truly lost? A deeper philosophical issue arises when we ask whether the soul, if it exists, can actually be lost. Some traditions argue that the soul is permanent and unchanging, unaffected by external events. Others suggest it can be obscured but never destroyed. There are also philosophies that reject the idea of a fixed soul altogether. In these views, identity is fluid, constantly shaped by experience, memory, and perception. What we call the self is not a single object, but an ongoing process. This creates a paradox in the language of soul loss. If the soul is permanent, it cannot be sold or lost. If it is fluid, then it was never a fixed possession to begin with. Yet people still experience moments that feel like loss. The tension between these perspectives suggests that the idea of the soul may be less about ontology and more about lived experience. It reflects how humans interpret continuity and change within themselves. Chapter 8. The moment of realization. Many accounts of losing oneself does not involve dramatic events, but quiet realizations. A person may suddenly look at their life and feel unfamiliar with the person they have become. This recognition is often subtle rather than catastrophic. Such moments can be triggered by success, failure, or transition. Achieving a long-sought goal may paradoxically create emptiness, while crisis can force reflection on past choices. In both cases, identity becomes visible as something that has shifted. The language of selling the soul often emerges in these reflections as a way of articulating regret or distance from earlier values. It gives shape to an otherwise abstract emotional state. However, these moments can also serve as turning points. The recognition of disconnection can create the possibility of reevaluation, where a person begins to question the path they have been following. Chapter 9. Is redemption possible? Across many belief systems, the idea of permanent special loss is uncommon. Instead, there is often an emphasis on renewal, transformation, or return. Even when actions have caused harm, change is still considered possible. This introduces a counterbalance to the fear embedded in the idea of selling the soul. If a person feels they have moved away from their values, they are not necessarily fixed in that state. Human identity is often treated as capable of adjustment and repair. Redemption, in this sense, does not require undoing the past. Instead, it involves reorientation, shifting present behavior and intention toward greater alignment with one's values. This challenges the finality implied in the phrase selling your soul. It suggests that even if people feel fragmented or disconnected, the process is not necessarily irreversible. Chapter 10. Why the question never disappears. The question persists because it reflects a fundamental human tension between desire and integrity. Every generation rephrases it according to its own cultural language, but the underlying concern remains constant. Whether framed in religious, philosophical, or psychological terms, the idea centers on the fear of becoming unrecognizable to oneself. It is not about literal transactions, but about long-term consequences of choices. The metaphor survives because it captures something difficult to express directly. The sense that certain decisions feel weightier than others, as if they affect more than just external outcomes. As long as humans continue to negotiate between ambition, survival, and meaning, the question of the soul, what it is, and whether it can be lost, will continue to reappear in new forms. Conclusion. The soul as a question, not a possession. The idea of selling the soul resists a single definition because it operates across multiple layers of meaning. It can be read literally in myth, symbolically in culture, and psychologically in experience. What remains consistent is the underlying human awareness that choices shape identity. Even when consequences are not immediately visible, people often sense that some decisions carry deeper significance. In this sense, the soul may function less as an object and more as a way of describing continuity within the self. It is a language for what it means to remain aligned or to drift away from one's core values. Perhaps the enduring power of the question lies in its ambiguity. It does not demand a final answer. Instead, it reflects an ongoing process, the attempt to understand what we become through the lives we live.